You didn't click this by accident. Something in you recognized the call. You felt it, the quiet war no one else sees, the pull toward truth, the weight of a destiny you can't explain. You walk through ordinary life carrying an extraordinary mark, and heaven knows your name even if the world doesn't. Scripture calls them the 144,000, but the real shock is this. The signs aren't coming, they're already active in you. The isolation, the trials, the strange peace and chaos, none of it is random. This is divine realism, not fantasy. And now that you've heard this, you're responsible for what awakens next. If you don't want to miss what's being revealed, you know what to do. Subscribe, like, share, comment, because once you see this, there's no unseeing it. Red heart. There is a moment that often comes long before you have language for it, a quiet realization that settles into your chest when you're still very young. You're standing in a room full of people, classmates, family, familiar faces, and yet something inside you is watching instead of joining. You notice how others laugh easily, how they seem to move in rhythm with one another, and you understand the rules well enough to imitate them, but not well enough to feel them. You're not lonely in the obvious sense. You're surrounded. Still, there's this subtle distance, like you're standing half a step outside the circle, aware of everything but not fully inside it. As a child, you don't call it spiritual or emotional or existential. You just know you're different and you don't know why. You become observant by necessity. While others are busy participating, you're quietly studying. You notice tone shifts, body language, unspoken rules. You sense emotions before words arrive. There's a depth to how you feel things, a heaviness and a beauty at the same time, and it sets you apart even when you wish it wouldn't. You feel joy intensely, but you also feel sorrow deeply, and you begin to understand early on that the world doesn't always know what to do with people like you. So you adapt. You learn to smile when expected, to say the right thing at the right time, to blend in just enough to avoid standing out too much. On the outside, you look normal, functional, fine. On the inside, there's a constant low-grade exhaustion from the performance of belonging. This masking becomes second nature. You get good at it. You learn how to be agreeable without being connected, how to be present without being seen. People may even admire how calm or mature you seem, unaware of the internal effort it takes to maintain that balance. But no matter how well you play the part, no environment ever fully resolves that restlessness. You move from place to place, season to season, relationship to relationship, hoping that eventually something will click. Yet the feeling follows you, not as rejection of people, but as a quiet sense that the ordinary is slightly misaligned with who you are. It's as if your soul remembers something your mind can't access, and that memory creates a longing without a clear object. For a long time, you wonder if something is wrong with you. You replay conversations, analyze your reactions, question your sensitivity. You try to fix yourself, to harden where you feel too soft, to shrink where you feel too large. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, another thought begins to surface. What if this discomfort isn't a flaw? What if it's intentional? What if the sense of not quite fitting is not a mistake, but a signal that you were never meant to settle too easily into a world that thrives on surface-level connection? As you grow older, the weight of life doesn't seem to distribute evenly. You notice that certain challenges don't just visit once and move on. They come back. Different faces, different circumstances, but the same fire. You think you've learned the lesson, endured the season, paid the price, only to find yourself facing a similar trial again. It can feel unfair, like life keeps pressing on the same bruise. You look around and see others moving forward with apparent ease, while your path feels heavier, more resistant. You ask yourself why progress seems to cost you more, why joy feels earned through endurance rather than given freely. In the middle of that confusion, it's easy to interpret pain as punishment. You assume you must be doing something wrong, missing something obvious. But over time, another perspective begins to form. What if the pressure isn't meant to crush you, but to shape you? What if the repeated trials are not evidence of failure, but of preparation? Endurance doesn't announce itself while it's being built. Character forms quietly, in places comfort can't reach. While it feels like nothing is happening, something essential is being constructed beneath the surface, like roots growing deep enough to hold weight you can't yet see. There's a spiritual gravity to your life that becomes harder to ignore. You begin to sense that what you're being prepared for isn't just about you. The resistance you face is proportional to the responsibility you'll one day carry. Influence without depth collapses, but depth formed through pressure lasts. Growth in these seasons is slow, silent, and often unseen by others, but it's real. And gradually, suffering starts to take on a different meaning. It becomes less of a question mark and more of a confirmation. Not that pain is good, but that it isn't random. Through endurance, your identity starts to emerge, not through achievement, but through survival and integrity. Alongside this shaping, there's another force you can't escape, a pull toward truth. You notice early on that you struggle to stay silent when something feels wrong. It's not that you enjoy conflict. In fact, it often costs you more than it gains, but compromise sits poorly in your spirit. Even small distortions feel heavy. Truth rises in you instinctively, not as a strategy, but as a reflex. When you try to ignore it, your body reacts. Your chest tightens. Your thoughts scatter. Peace feels distant. Truth for you isn't a preference, it's oxygen. You develop an internal compass that keeps redirecting you, sometimes after mistakes, sometimes in the middle of them. When you act out of alignment, restlessness follows. When you correct course, even if the outcome is uncertain, there's relief. This commitment to integrity doesn't come without loss. Relationships strain under the weight of honesty. People misunderstand your intensity, label it stubbornness, assume arrogance where there is conviction. Isolation often follows doing the right thing when it's unpopular. You learn that truth doesn't always gather crowds. Sometimes it separates you from them. Still, this alignment reveals something about who you are becoming. Truth is not a skill you've learned. It's a seal on your identity. You're not meant to blend into every environment. Light exposes by nature. It doesn't apologize for what it reveals. And while that can feel lonely, it's also clarifying. You begin to understand that your role is not to maintain false peace, but to embody quiet integrity, even when it costs you comfort. There are seasons, though, when even alignment feels exhausting. Times when life feels like swimming against a relentless current. You put in effort, prayer, discipline, and yet nothing seems to move. You push and push, but peace stays out of reach. The work feels heavy, unrewarded. You're doing everything you know how to do, and still the fruit doesn't appear. It's not laziness or lack of commitment. It's something deeper, a misalignment between effort and flow. Then, almost unexpectedly, there are moments that feel different. Moments when, even in struggle, clarity emerges. Support arrives at just the right time. Direction becomes tangible, not because circumstances are easy, but because something clicks internally. You realize there's a difference between resistance that refines and obstruction that drains. Some opposition sharpens focus. Other opposition is a signal to pause, to listen, to recalibrate. Weariness, you begin to see, isn't always a sign to push harder. Sometimes it's a spiritual signal asking you to check whether you're striving or being sent. This realization can be unsettling, especially if you're used to measuring faith by effort. You may notice times when your spiritual life becomes mechanical. Prayer turns into routine, words spoken more out of habit than connection. Scripture passes through your eyes without reaching your heart. Worship becomes performance instead of encounter. On the outside, you're still doing the right things. On the inside, something feels distant. Your soul senses the gap before your mind can explain it. You serve without joy. You show up without hunger. Faith feels like obligation instead of relationship. Yet even here, there's an invitation. Purpose has a way of restoring intimacy. When you realign with why you were called, sensitivity returns. Obedience, not as duty but as response, reignites something dormant. You remember that presence was never withdrawn. It was waiting. Renewal doesn't come from trying harder, but from listening more honestly, from returning to alignment rather than routine. And as that awareness begins to stir, something in you wakes up again, not all at once, but enough to remind you that this story is still unfolding, that what feels unresolved is not abandoned, and that the quiet tension you've carried from the beginning is still leading you somewhere meaningful. Orange heart. There comes a point when you start to notice that provision doesn't behave the way you were taught it should. You work hard, you stay disciplined, you show up consistently, yet something always feels just out of reach. It may be financial strain that never fully eases, emotional support that feels thin, or relational stability that never quite settles. You're always managing, always sustaining, always compensating. It's not that nothing comes in, but what does arrive seems to disappear just as quickly. And over time, the effort to maintain what drains you becomes exhausting. You begin to wonder why survival requires so much force. Slowly, a pattern begins to emerge. Whenever you move in a direction that feels deeply aligned, even if it's uncertain, provision appears in unexpected ways. Not excess, not luxury, but exactly what's needed. And whenever you push forward out of obligation, fear, or self-created responsibility, lack intensifies. It's unsettling at first because it challenges the idea that effort alone produces supply. You start to realize that provision isn't following your ambition, it's responding to your assignment. There's a difference between what you choose to carry and what you're actually called to hold. You see this pattern echoed in ancient stories, where sustenance didn't come in advance or in storage, but daily, and only within the path of obedience. Supply wasn't meant to be hoarded or redirected. It functioned as confirmation, not security, and that realization hits close to home. You recognize how often you've tried to support visions that were never given to you, to sustain structures built from expectation rather than calling. You took responsibility for outcomes that were never assigned and wondered why the weight felt unbearable. Alignment changes that. Obedience doesn't just please, it positions. Provision becomes less about striving and more about standing where you're meant to stand. As alignment sharpens, another reality becomes harder to ignore. There is opposition, and it doesn't always make sense on the surface. You feel emotional heaviness without a clear cause. Mental fog rolls in suddenly. Fatigue settles deeper than the body can explain. You rest but don't feel restored. You pray but the resistance lingers. It's not dramatic, not overtly destructive. It's subtle, persistent, wearing. And at some point you understand that this pressure isn't random. Something unseen is responding to something in you that you may not have fully named yet. There's a strange truth in realizing that opposition often recognizes potential before the individual does. The resistance isn't aimed at destroying you outright. It's aimed at distracting you, delaying you, dulling your awareness. If you were insignificant, there would be no need for such sustained interference. And even though the pressure is heavy, it's also formative. Strength is being developed in places comfort could never reach. Authority isn't granted in ease, it's forged in conflict. Endurance deepens whatever rests on your life. The very fact that you're still standing, still searching, still responding, becomes assurance. Survival itself begins to feel like evidence of protection, like proof that purpose is quietly asserting itself through persistence. Then come the losses. Sudden, sharp, often without warning. Relationships end, opportunities vanish, doors close that you assumed were permanent. The pain feels personal, almost targeted, because it's not just what's lost, but how abruptly it disappears. You replay conversations, revisit decisions, try to locate the mistake that caused the removal. But clarity doesn't come immediately. Instead, there's space. Too much of it. And loneliness settles in, not as abandonment, but as exposure. With time, you start to see what those attachments were doing, how they limited growth, how they anchored you to versions of yourself that couldn't carry what was coming next. Some connections couldn't coexist with the future being prepared. Their absence wasn't punishment, it was precision. Loneliness becomes a refining ground. Dependency shifts slowly, painfully, from external validation to something eternal and steadier. Maturity forms quietly in the absence of distraction. You begin to understand that letting go isn't failure, it's prerequisite. Loss reframes itself as strategy, clearing space for increase that would have been impossible otherwise. One of the most confusing losses comes from places that were supposed to feel safe, sacred spaces, communities built around shared language and belief. You expect understanding there, support, recognition. Instead, you encounter resistance. Your vision feels uncomfortable to others. Your questions seem threatening. Your presence disrupts more than it blends. You're labeled intense, divisive, misguided. Not because you're wrong, but because what you carry doesn't fit neatly within existing structures. So you do what you've learned to do best. You stay, but you guard. You participate outwardly while retreating inwardly. It's not rebellion, it's survival. You've seen this pattern before, though maybe you didn't recognize it as your own. Voices sent to awaken often meet resistance from systems built to preserve. Truth challenges comfort, and comfort resists disruption. Approval, you realize, is not a requirement for obedience. Fire reveals what structures are willing to burn, and what they're desperately trying to protect. Through all of this, something unexpected begins to anchor you: peace. Not the kind that comes from solved problems or favorable outcomes, but something deeper and steadier. Circumstances may be collapsing, plans unraveling, relationships shifting, yet inside, there's a calm that doesn't match the chaos. It doesn't deny the pain, it doesn't minimize the loss. It simply exists alongside it unshaken. This peace isn't emotional optimism, it's presence. It doesn't argue with fear, it outlasts it. You notice that despair doesn't take root the way it once did. Pain is real, but it doesn't hollow you out. Trust begins to override understanding. You stop needing every question answered to remain steady. Peace becomes both guidance and guard, steering you away from panic-driven decisions and protecting you from being consumed by uncertainty. It feels intimate, personal, like a quiet assurance that you're being held even when nothing else feels secure. And then there's the moment that doesn't feel like learning but remembering. No one convinces you. No argument persuades you. Something is recognized, not explained. It stirs emotion before thought, resonance before logic. You feel it in your body, a subtle but undeniable response. A familiarity that doesn't make sense based on experience alone. It's as if something ancient and dormant has been activated. You realize you've always known this in fragments, in feelings you couldn't articulate. The confirmation comes from within, ahead of reasoning. Awareness doesn't arrive as new information. It returns like something reclaimed. Identity isn't constructed in that moment. It's recalled. And crossing that threshold doesn't end the journey. It begins a new internal chapter, one marked by clarity rather than confusion. Looking back, patterns that once felt cruel or meaningless now form a coherent shape. The displacement, the trials, the resistance, the losses, the peace, they weren't isolated events. They were signals. And you begin to sense that you're not alone in this realization. Others are awakening too, quietly, without announcement. Not through loud movements or declarations, but through recognition. A collective remembering unfolding simultaneously across different lives, different places. There's no rush in this awareness. No pressure to perform or prove. Just stillness, recognition, a readiness that doesn't strain. The understanding that this is not an ending, but the beginning of seeing clearly, of moving forward without confusion about why the path has been the way it has. And with that clarity comes a grounded calm, as if everything that once felt scattered has finally found its place, waiting for what comes next. If this message unsettled you, it's because your spirit recognized itself. You weren't entertained, you were confronted. The moral is clear. When divine truth finds you, neutrality is no longer an option. You carry responsibility now because awareness activates destiny. Ignore it and confusion remains. Acknowledge it and alignment begins. What you do next reveals who you choose to be. If this spoke to you, don't hide in silence. Comment, share, like, and subscribe. Because those who refuse to respond often lose the clarity they were just given.